Derek Scott is the Haileybury Principal and CEO of the the Australian School Principal of the Year. Derek, I mean, we're having a bit of a laugh about the things that we do, like lifting and jamming your teacher's, Morris Mini Minor between two gum trees and it was stuck there for 3 days, versus teachers actually being hit and punched. What sort of discipline issues do we have according to this survey?
Yeah, look, I think the survey, which is a global survey, shows there's clear issues with some discipline, concentration and focus issues in Australian schools. And there's a direct correlation between perhaps some declining standards there and the academic outcomes that were further reported yesterday in the international PISA assessment, which is the OECD assessment. Historically, I think it's important to realise, the last 12 years have seen a change in the way our young people are growing up, because 12 years ago the first smartphone came on the market and had a very big impact quickly, a saturation impact. I think about 80% of Australian individuals now have a smartphone of some sort, and our students are growing up with that. So focus, concentration, discipline around that are really important issues to think about.
So not only is our discipline ranked really badly, also our literacy rates when it comes to mathematics, when it comes to reading and English as well. I mean, surely we can't be blaming the mobile phone for that.
No, but there's a whole picture that comes together here, and it is perhaps a picture that says, as an education system in Australia, or the systems that apply to Australia, we've taken our eye off the ball a bit. We've tended to go down the path of fads a little bit much without focusing as much as we should on the basics. And the basics of education are literacy and numeracy. As much as we like to talk about the future and collaboration and teamwork and analytical and creative skills and all of these things that are very important, none of that is going to see our students succeed unless they have great core skills in literacy and numeracy, and that's what we've got to be focused on. And that means a disciplined, focused classroom with a clear strategy for all the teachers and a clear pedagogy behind it so that all the students are learning and not falling through the net.
How do you do that, though? Is that easier said than done?
Well, no, it's not easy because, of course, we have multiple jurisdictions in Australia and we have federation makes it very complex. But we do know what works. And what works for teaching literacy in schools is an explicit teaching approach with phonics, which is sounding out words and teaching students through that. Explicit teaching means that the students are focused. It goes through an I do. The teacher does the first direction, then we do, the class does it, and then the you do, then the students themselves do it individually or in small groups. If we all apply a strategy like that, we know this works. The evidence is clear. But we've tended to follow paths in our early years of school, of inquiry learning, and other processes which work for some students but not for others. So we have a very fragmented structure. We have a lot of great people in the classroom, but too much where the teachers are following their own adventure and not enough structure and discipline and focus on the pedagogy that we know works and will deliver the outcomes for students.
How much of this, though, is about the parents? And again, is all of the emphasis being put onto the teachers and all of the responsibility being put onto the teachers? If young people, if children are being disrespectful in classroom, is that not because fundamentally they're not being taught how to behave in society? Is that the teacher's role?
I think it's both the parents and the teachers. And we know our parents are very busy, many working, both parents working, the very few of some of the social institutions that we used to have, that students will be a part of are no longer there. So it's a clear responsibility for the schools, but also with the parents. And we must be respectful of each other's position, but be prepared to be clear on having high expectations and to have discipline outcomes when students breach those expectations as well. But as well as that, discipline problems are far less in classrooms where there is structure and clarity and, of course, where the students are learning. Because when the students are learning and enjoying success, they are happy and focused.
I wonder, and I'm I'm not even sure how to phrase this, but, when we were growing up in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you were really scared to muck up and to do something disrespectful or naughty. And people are saying there's a difference between naughtiness and disrespectfulness and nastiness in class, and I totally agree with that. But, there were really big consequences if you did something wrong in class. And a lot of the times they were physical, so of course they shouldn't be in place today. But there were consequences. How we discipline now is an ongoing conversation in society, from parents to schools, and mucking up and being disrespectful and acting however you want to is almost a hell of a lot easier now than it once was.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I think our young people are very aware of their individual rights, but perhaps less so about the collective responsibility, or the individual and the collective responsibility that we have as to be good members of society. And that flows a little bit from the parents as well. Clearly, it's a good thing that we've moved on. I remember getting the strap at school myself.
I'm not saying by any means. Yeah, I don't want the blackboard ruler, whacked against my butt ever again. But
that's exactly right. Yeah.
But there were consequences, weren't there? I'm just wondering what the consequences are now. People say, well, I'm not going to muck up in class because if I do, X, Y, and Z will happen.
Yeah, and that's clearly where the teacher, the school, and the parents need to work together. We need to be prepared to have some punitive punishments in the form of, there's nothing wrong with keeping a student behind to explain behaviour or work through. We also need to have a mixture of practices, such as a restorative justice practice, where, when things happen between students, you're involving them in mediation to resolve the issues as well. So it's got to be that combination of things. But there's nothing wrong with, setting clear expectation for students and giving students, expecting them to have ownership of that behaviour and having consequence when that behaviour is not met.
Derek Scott is with you. He's the Principal and CEO of Haileybury. He's also been named Australian School Principal of the Year. I'll get to your calls on 1300 222 774 in just a moment. This survey, this global survey, was done where we pretty much have come out looking quite terrible in a lot of areas. I did find it interesting that predominantly the students that were surveyed were 15 years old. Now, that is a really problematic age. We know that many schools now are putting Year 9 students aside, segregating them, so to speak. We know that 15 is a tricky age. So does that explain why we've rated so badly in this survey? Because 15-year-olds quite possibly are going through some big stuff and not acting the way they always have or always will?
No, it doesn't, because the survey has been done every 3 years since 2000 when it started with the numeracy, and since 2003 when it added mathematics to that as well. It's done for the same age students in 70-odd countries around the world. Just to clarify one thing, they're not, for Australia, what we're seeing is declining results in absolute terms, a decline in our literacy standards and a decline in our numeracy standards and a decline in the rankings. We're still ranking in the 16 for maths and 29 out of 79 countries for literacy. But so what we've got to do is address that decline and at the very least get us back to the position where we were in 2003 and then try and lift it from there. So it's partly about behaviour, but it's also partly about the fact that we don't have a unified pedagogy, a unified approach to teaching literacy and numeracy in our primary school classrooms. We have over 30 teacher training institutions in Australia, and they all follow their own path and a different path. So we have teachers emerging into schools who are not fully equipped with the unified pedagogy that can ensure that every student is taught in a similar way as they go through that school on literacy and numeracy. Singapore, as an example of a really high rating country, has same size roughly as Victoria, has one teacher training institution, a unified pedagogy, a unified approach to the way to teach, and that makes sure that the students are not being left behind, that every student is being pushed through.
Derek, stay with us. Jill's in Coburg. Jill, what did you want to say?
Oh, hello. Thanks for taking my call. Yes, I've got a background in teaching in a lot of schools of supporting children with hearing impairments. And so I've seen inside a lot of classrooms and some terrific teaching going on. But my bugbear is open plan classrooms. The acoustics are dreadful. You've got these large echoing spaces. It's very hard for even people with good hearing to hear what the teacher's saying. The inquiry learner collaborative process that the principal at Haileybury was talking about tends to be sort of very unstructured, and it's extremely distracting environment.
I think noise was you raised a really good point, Jill, because I know in this global survey noise was a big part of it, Derek, wasn't it? So thank you, Jill, for your comment there. Noise and distraction and kids. I mean, you know yourself, if you work in a noisy workplace, you can't concentrate and you get distracted and you get irritated. And
Jill is absolutely right. That is a clear example of where a fad has emerged into education which has overtaken what the evidence tells us works. So you have an open plan classroom, it's an architectural fad, you put 60 students in the classroom, 3 teachers, and the teachers move around and rotate around. And of course you lose focus and concentration. There is no evidence of all the 5,000 or so studies that have been done since the 1960s on this, that it actually has any positive impact on literacy or numeracy outcomes for students. And yet we see more and more schools picking up on this and designing their classrooms that way.
A text here saying, my son has a friend who's been a complete bully and so disrespectful to adults, telling them to shut up, I hate you, etc. And this is even as a 5-year-old. After years of it, I talked to the teacher, spoke to their parents, says this text. The parents just say, oh, he's spirited and not taking any ownership for his attitude. I mean, it's an interesting text, and there's a few along those lines. And I'm wondering how much of this is just a reflection of society, Derek, and not necessarily school.
Well, there's no doubt that the civil discourse in society has changed and declined as well, hasn't it? And the access to social media and immediate responses and the sort of things we see on the internet are reflected in some of the personal behaviours as well. So absolutely it is the responsibility of parents and schools and everyone to build that respectful relationship. But we really need to support the principals and the teachers to make sure that they get the backup when they are being either have deeply problematic students who are challenging them, or have parents also. And I know from discussion with many principals that many have received both verbal and physical abuse from students on regular occasions, and from parents as well.
Well, this is certainly just the beginning, and certainly not the first time or the last time we'll have a conversation like this. Derek, thank you. Derek Scott is the principal and CEO of Haileybury. He's also been named the Australian Principal of the Year.